Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
The idea that reality can be simulated by computers was popularised by the Matrix series of movies, though there are earlier precedents. Among popular public thinkers advocating for the simulation hypothesis is Elon Musk, who stated, if you assume any rate of improvement at all, games will eventually be indistinguishable from reality, before concluding that it's most likely we're in a simulation.
The strongest argument for being in a simulation, probably being in a simulation, I think is the following. 40 years ago, we had Pong, like 2 rectangles and a dot. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations with millions of people playing simultaneously, and it's getting better every year. And soon we'll have virtual reality, we'll have augmented reality. If you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality. Even if that rate of advancement drops by 1,000 from what it is right now, then you just say, well, let's imagine it's 10,000 years in the future, which is nothing in the evolutionary scale. So given that we're clearly on a trajectory to have games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games could be played on any set-top box or on a PC or whatever, and there would probably be billions of such computers or set-top boxes, it would seem to follow that the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions.
Another high-profile proponent to the hypothesis is famous astrophysicist Neil Degrasse Tyson, who said in an NBC News interview that the hypothesis is correct, giving better than 50-50 odds, and adding, "I wish I could summon a strong argument against it, but I can find none."
I wish I had a good argument against that hypothesis, and I do not. Someone programs a universe, and in there they gain maturity and technology, and then they program a universe. So you can have nested, simulated universes all the way down, but there's only one real universe. Now throw a dart at all those universes, which one are you most likely to hit? A simulated universe.
In a review of the literature on simulated realities, philosopher Nick Bostrom argues that although it is difficult to prove that we are living in a simulation, it is nevertheless generally considered acceptable philosophy to question the reality of our own existence. Bostrom's simulation hypothesis is based on the idea that there are various ways that human beings might create an artificial universe. It could involve the development of a device which could convince its occupants, the simulated humans, that they are real. The argument is based on the assumption that these humans would not be able to identify it as a simulation. Bostrom argues that the resulting counterintuitive implications of his argument are, in fact, fully compatible with everything we know. Bostrom's argument can be shortly summarised as follows. A typical member of an advanced civilization would have a high probability of being among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. Therefore, if we are typical, we should consider that we might be living in a simulation. Thus, the possibility that we are living in a simulation is greater than we might have supposed.
It's a kind of probabilistic argument that purports to impose a constraint on what you can coherently believe about the future and your place in the universe. And it tries to show that one of 3 propositions is true. The first is that there is a very universal pattern where virtually all civilizations at our current stage of technological development go extinct before they reach technological maturity. The second proposition, the second alternative as it were, is that there is a very strong convergence among all technologically mature civilizations. They all lose interest in creating what I call ancestor simulations. These would be computer simulations, detailed computer simulations of people like their historical predecessors, detailed enough that the simulated creatures would be conscious. And the third proposition, the third alternative, is that we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation.
If all civilizations eventually reach a post-human stage with strong enough computer technology, then it must be likely for some, very advanced civilizations, to create large numbers of simulations of their ancestors or predecessors created at various points in time. Based on this logic, it is very likely that we are descendants of ancestors who were themselves created in a simulation. At some point in the future, human civilization will have the technological ability to create simulations of reality, and these simulations must include at least one copy of human civilization. Therefore, the argument runs, it is plausible that we are currently living in a simulation. Some hypotheses hold that if it is possible to simulate reality, then it is also possible to leave behind copies of everyone within these simulations. It has further been suggested that these simulated people may be conscious or sentient, although this idea belongs more in the realm of philosophy rather than scientific inquiry. If the fraction of all people within our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1, then it follows that we probably live in a simulation. Some philosophers disagree, proposing that perhaps sims do not have conscious experiences in the same way that unsimulated humans do, or that it can otherwise be self-evident to a human that they are human rather than a sim. Although the simulation hypothesis has sound philosophical arguments, before it's taken seriously, scientifically, proponents of the hypothesis have to produce experiments to support the idea with evidence. A method to test one type of simulation hypothesis was proposed in 2012 in a joint paper by physicists at the University of Washington. Under the assumption of finite computational resources, the simulation of the universe will be performed by dividing the continuum space-time into a discrete set of points. In analogy with the mini-simulations that lattice gauge theorists run today to build up nuclei from the underlying theory of strong interactions, known as quantum chromodynamics, several observational consequences of a grid-like space-time have been studied in their work. Among proposed signatures is an anisotropy in the distribution of ultra-high energy cosmic rays that, if observed, would be consistent with the simulation hypothesis according to these physicists.
I think most likely, this is just about probability, there are many simulations. These simulations are, we might as well call them reality, or you could call them the multiverse. Well, when we create a simulation, like a game or a movie, it's a distillation of what's interesting about life. You know, like it takes a year to shoot an action movie, and then that's all distilled down into 2 or 3 hours. Let me tell you, if you see an action movie being filmed, it's boring, super boring. There's like lots of takes, everything's in a green screen, looks pretty goofy, doesn't look cool, but once you add the CGI, have great editing, it's amazing. So I think most likely, if we're a simulation, it's really boring outside the simulation. Because why would you make a simulation that's boring? You'd make the simulation way more interesting than base reality.
Some critics propose that we could be living in a base reality, meaning we are in the first generation, and all the simulated people that will one day be created do not exist. The cosmologist Sean Carroll argues that the simulation hypothesis leads to a contradiction. If we are typical, it is assumed, and we are not capable of performing simulations, this contradicts the arguer's assumption that it is easy for us to foresee that other civilizations can most likely perform simulations. Detractors further argue that the simulation hypothesis also suffers from circular reasoning. The argument assumes that the simulation would leave behind evidence of its creation in order to infer our existence. They say proponents of the hypothesis must show how we could be living in a simulation and how, given this scenario, a particular civilization would be capable of identifying itself as such. Some thinkers have pointed out that the simulation hypothesis is not a scientific hypothesis in the normal sense, because it makes no predictions about measurements and observations that could be tested. It has further been argued that the simulation hypothesis is unfalsifiable. If we can never have a definitive proof of our reality being base, then the hypothesis remains a philosophical conundrum and not a valid scientific theory. But if you take the simulation hypothesis seriously, economist Robin Hanson argues that a self-interested occupant of a high-fidelity simulation should strive to be entertaining and praiseworthy in order to avoid being turned off, or being shunted into a non-conscious, low-fidelity part of the simulation. But on the other side of the coin of this line of reasoning, Hanson additionally speculates that someone who is aware that he might be a simulation might also start to care less about others. At the very least, the first part of this argument, striving to live a good and interesting life, is compatible with both worldviews, whether we're living in a base reality or not. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? Then show your support by subscribing, ringing the bell, and enabling notifications to never miss videos like this.